is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, LBC's been told the majority of criminals released from prison won't be supervised after 2/3 of their time out on licence. It's in an attempt to cut down on workloads of probation officers. Well, our reporter Fraser Knight has more on this and says it was announced privately to staff last week.
It means most criminals won't have to meet with their probation officer at the very end of their licence term. But some people in the service have raised concerns it could mean that the public is at a higher risk of harm. Ministers insist, though, the worst offenders will still be monitored.
A watchdog's called for Wandsworth Prison to be put into emergency measures over concerns about security failings. The Chief Inspector of Prisons also identified problems with overcrowding, drugs, violence and self-harm. The government says it will strengthen the management team in the coming weeks. A 22-year-old man's been arrested after a woman was stabbed to death in North London. The victim, thought to be in her 60s, died on Burnt Oak Broadway in Edgware. Natalie Elphicke has apologised for some of the comments she's made in the past following criticism from her new Labour colleagues. The MP for Dover crossed the floor at PMQs yesterday, accusing Rishi Sunak of broken promises. She's gone back on support she once gave her ex-husband Charlie Elphicke following his sexual assault conviction in 2020. Israeli forces say a military operation planned for Rafah in Gaza will go ahead as planned. That's despite the US President warning the offensive would lead to a cut in military aid. And the Chancellor has welcomed what he called real optimism from the Bank of England about the prospect of lower interest rates. The base rate has been held at 5.25% for the sixth time in a row, but a cut could be around the corner. Governor Andrew Bailey says inflation is likely to fall close to 2% over the next few months. Jeremy Hunt has welcomed some caution.
I would much rather that they waited until they're absolutely sure inflation is on a downward trajectory than rushed into a decision that they had to reverse at a later stage. What we want is sustainably low interest rates.
And the Chancellor will be speaking to Nick Ferrari on LBC tomorrow morning. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed 27 points at 83.81. The pound buys $1.25 and €1.16. LBC weather mostly dry and settled tonight. A band of rain in the far north moving northeastwards and a low of 5 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Very good evening. 3 minutes past 8 is the time on LBC. The subject that we're going to talk about in this hour is kind of allied to the last one because it is all to do with the conflict in the Middle East. Or I say all to do. It's not all to do with it, but it has an impact on it because I think everyone's aware that there's been a huge rise in anti-Semitic incidents across the country. There has also been a rise in Islamophobic incidents, it has to be said as well, though not to the same extent. And it's all related to the war in Gaza. And this has been especially the case on university campuses. Now, I've always gone from the premise that universities should be bastions of free speech where people can live together, can study together, can debate together in an atmosphere of mutual respect. That seems no longer to be the case in many of our universities, where if you are a Jewish student, you are made to feel as if you are the other. Now, we've been through this before in our history, and yet no one seems to learn from it. And if you don't learn from history, you repeat it. And that, I'm afraid, is what's going on at the moment, not just in this country, but across Europe. We've seen tonight some terrible scenes outside the Eurovision Song Contest in Malmö, where protesters genuinely think that the Israeli entry should be banned from the contest. Now, the Israeli singer has been holed up in her hotel room on security advice. Now, just think about it. This is a song contest. It's a song contest. There were reports today from my old university, the University of East Anglia, where the student union were going to show the Eurovision Song Contest on Saturday night on a big screen. But they were going to black out the Israeli entry if it makes it through to the final. I mean, just think about that for a moment. I mean, what have we come to when students think that that is the right thing to do, that what message does it send to the Jewish students at the University of East Anglia? Now, in the last few minutes, they backtracked on that. Thank goodness that they've seen sense at last. There are all sorts of incidents. I've got a whole panoply of incidents at various universities in front of me here, which I could read out the whole lot. I won't do at the moment because I'd rather hear it from you. If you are a Jewish student at university and you feel that your safety is at risk, not just your safety, but you are really shocked by what is going on among your fellow students, people who maybe you've regarded as friends. We heard from someone, was it last week or the week before, a student who had started university in October and within 2 weeks just felt like leaving because of the way that she was being ostracised purely because she was a Jew. Now, some people, and I am going to say this, some people on the left seem to think that discrimination against Jews is okay in the same way that discrimination against people of colour is not okay. Now, to my mind, you're either against discrimination or you're not. I mean, you can't differentiate between people who you think should be discriminated against. What is it in our society that makes people feel that anti-Semitism is sort of acceptable in a way that overt racism is not? Well, today the Prime Minister held a meeting in Downing Street with university vice-chancellors and other people from the world of education. And I hope he sort of laid the law down to them to make sure that they are doing all they can to stamp out any forms of anti-Semitism at their universities. Well, Edward Isaacs was there. He's with me in the studio now, President of the Union of Jewish Students. And he's going to be taking your calls over the course of this hour. I want to get to the bottom of how bad things are, because sometimes when you do a phone-in like this, people say, oh, you're just exaggerating. It's not really that bad. It's just the sort of odd isolated incidents, and people just don't know any better. Well, people should know better. If you're at university, you should know better. It doesn't matter what your politics are. It doesn't matter whether you support Israel or you support Palestine. The fact of the matter is that everybody, whether they're Palestinian, whether they're Israeli, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Muslim, they have a right to exist. They have a right to hold the views that they do, and they have a right to be listened to. Now, I just think that ought not to have to be said. But in this day and age, it seems that it does. Well, Edward, welcome.
Thank you.
In a way, I wish you weren't here, because if you weren't here, there wouldn't be a problem. But there is a problem, and we can't sort of brush it under the carpet. Now, what has been your experience from your colleagues in the Union of Jewish Students? I said I've got a whole list of incidents that have happened. Just give me a few examples of the kind of situations that your members are facing on a day-to-day basis.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me on this evening. It's a pleasure to be here, despite the circumstances. For the last 7 months, Jewish students have been experiencing what can only be described as a crisis on campus, in terms of we have seen the worst anti-Semitism on campus that we've seen in a generation. Jewish students have received death threats. Jewish students have been physically assaulted. Jewish student property has been damaged. And it's deeply, deeply concerning to us, because ultimately Jewish students just want to go about their lives like every other student, enjoying their time at university, being able to go out and party and enjoy and have drinks and much more, get on with their degrees, enjoy their seminars. But very simply, this has been a year like no other for them. And it's incredibly disturbing for us. And I appreciate there's been a huge amount of media attention recently on these encampments, but really this is merely just a continuation of what we've seen now for 7 months.
Do you fear that things are going to get worse? Because we've seen the scenes in America, and it seems as though these sort of encampments are starting to spring up in some UK universities, and that could lead to some horrific scenes.
Well, thankfully, the reality is that we are nowhere near, thankfully, what we have seen in America, in terms of the violence that we've seen there amongst much more. But today's roundtable at Downing Street demonstrated that really the fate as to whether it's what we see on campus turns into what it seems that we've seen in America lies with vice-chancellors. They need the moral clarity in their leadership to be clear, to respect the right to protest, but to draw red lines, and currently many aren't doing that.
Why? Why aren't they?
I think very simply they are dealing with a situation that none of us have dealt with before. But I don't think that excuses the lack of action by so many Vice-Chancellors.
But what could they do?
Well, we've been clear to Vice-Chancellors in terms of what we want to see them do. Firstly, communication is key. And communication both with the Jewish society and Jewish students on campus so they feel listened to and heard. Because if they don't know what's going on in terms of the senior management at the university, then very simply they might as well think nothing's going on, the situation's being simply ignored. We need to also see communication as well with wider student bodies. Vice-Chancellors have so often lacked the moral clarity to be able to singularly condemn anti-Semitism when there are instances of anti-Semitism which impact Jewish students. Then beyond that, in terms of collaboration with police forces, we have seen incidents of the glorification and celebration of the acts of a proscribed terrorist group on campus. Now, Tom Tugendhat, the security minister this morning, made it very clear. That's simply illegal. And we need to see universities, where necessary, utilise these relationships to clamp down on this kind of behaviour. And then beyond that...
But how do they clamp down? Because it's all very well saying, well, Vice-Chancellors need to do this, that or the other. But, I mean, if I was a Vice-Chancellor and listening to you saying that, I think, OK, well, that's a fair point. But how do I clamp down on that?
Well, Vice-Chancellors have the tools to do so. The majority of universities across England have adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, yet we aren't seeing universities utilise it. So one of the points that we put to Vice-Chancellors is that we need to see them reassert the importance of IHRA in the face of these protests, and they need to actually use it, because they might as well have not adopted it if they aren't using it.
But OK, they can use it, but what then? I mean, are you? Let's cut to the quick here. Are you suggesting that Vice-Chancellors should say anybody that, for example, is showing a Hamas poster, a supportive poster for Hamas or whatever, they should be expelled from the university?
Well, listen, universities have kind of varying codes of conducts, but they exist, and the code of conducts are there to be used, and we need to see due process happen. So I'm not going to comment on the specific universities in that respect. But
I wasn't asking you to, but as a matter of general policy, if you want them to clamp down, I mean, clamping down, I mean, that's a sort of fairly evocative phrase. You must have an idea of some of the measures that you expect them to take, and just sort of saying, well, we want them to agree to a statement. I mean, that's not exactly clamping down, is it?
Well, where necessary, we need to see, we have seen already the intervention of the police in terms of arrests being made, both of nefarious non-student agitators who are seeking to stir up trouble on campus, as well as the...
And who are they? Or is it the usual suspects, those sort of like far-left anarchist groups?
We've seen action from the Socialist Workers' Party, amongst many others, along with just individuals in the local community. Only last week did we see an individual turn up just outside the University of Leeds campus, suggesting that the Jewish chaplain there shouldn't be approached unarmed, and then later return to campus having been arrested, breaking their bail conditions, stating that Zionism is fascism, amongst much more, then harassing Jewish students, saying they are killing thousands of babies. This is the lived reality.
What did the Prime Minister say at this meeting? Were you satisfied with his approach?
Very much so. We're incredibly grateful for the support of government, and he was very forthcoming in saying, and has been since, that anti-Semitism has no place on campus. And the government was very supportive this morning in saying that we are here to help you, university leaders, in tackling this problem. We are here to give you the tools necessary to do so. But now really the impetus is on Vice-Chancellors to take decisive action to ensure that campuses are places where Jewish students feel included.
I saw a tweet yesterday, and it did turn out to be true, but slightly different from how it was maybe portrayed. But the tweet said that the National Union of Students had voted to eject your organisation, the Union of Jewish Students. Now, it turns out that it was at the NUS conference, which took place a few weeks ago. But in a side meeting, I don't know how many people were at this meeting, but that vote did take place, and they did vote to expel you. Now, the NUS itself has not gone down that road, but I mean, we all know that in the past it's had a few issues with anti-Semitism. Give us your version of what happened at that meeting.
Well, I think it's important just to start with the context that just over a year ago there was an independent KC-led report into anti-Semitism within the student movement that found that NUS was riddled with anti-Semitism and was a place where Jewish students simply aren't welcome. We were looking to this conference to really be the conference where actually there has been that shift in terms of the ability for Jewish students to engage in this kind of conference. But very simply, I attended as in my role as president of the Union of Jewish Students, and at this kind of workshop, it was very clear that the Jewish students that we were there to support were made to feel incredibly unwelcome. While there wasn't an explicit vote, there was a discussion about whether UJS should be a voice for Jewish students inside these NUS spaces, given our support for Israel and given our support for the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And non-Jewish delegates decided it was their place to decide who represents Jewish students.
Which, I mean, I don't know whether you class that as anti-Semitic or anti whatever, but there's no justice in that, is there?
It was incredibly disappointing for a lot of the Jewish students that were there. We were there to support them, and the majority of them, at any points during that session, had to leave and come and receive welfare support from various members of our team, amongst much more.
Well, the NUS has released a statement today. It says, a lie is circulating online that NUS have voted to disengage with UJS. This is categorically untrue. It is shameful to spread misinformation and fear among Jewish students at a time when tensions are already so heightened. The truth is that NUS in fact stopped a small group of students who tried to call UJS's legitimacy into question. I presumably have no issue with that statement.
Well, having been there, we take exception with the fact that a member of the NUS Democratic Procedures Committee even deemed it acceptable to agree to actually do a show of hands in the room as to who agrees or who doesn't agree with UJS as the legitimate voice of Jewish students in the National Union of Students.
And what proportion did agree with that?
The vast majority, that we shouldn't be there.
And I mean, we haven't met before. I don't know sort of how many members you've got or the structures of the Union of Jewish Students, but I mean, you don't seem to be particularly radical to me. You seem to be a very moderate person, and I'm thinking, well, how can they possibly object to a moderate group of people who want to represent Jewish students?
We have a very proud, over 100-year history of being the representative voice of Jewish students, and it's incredibly disappointing to see. But listen, I'm incredibly proud and privileged to represent every one of the 9,000 Jewish students across the UK and Ireland, and it's a privilege to be able to work with them and to go visit them on campus every day.
Well, let's take some calls next. If you want to watch us, you can do so, by the way, on Global Player or the LBC YouTube channel. If you'd like to speak to Edward directly, feel free. If you've got some anecdotes of your own about how maybe you as a Jewish student are being treated by your fellow students, or indeed your tutors at university, because I've heard some fairly horrific things about some of the academic staff and the way that they're treating Jewish students as well. But it's all very well us sort of having an hour where we say, wasn't it terrible? But we've got to actually try and think of some solutions here. Edward talked about universities clamping down. Well, what does that mean? What would that look like at your university? 0345 6060 973. That is the number to call. Somebody's saying, I love it when texts start with Dale, because you kind of know what's going to come. Dale being as unbalanced as usual. Where are the people representing the students protesting? We're not talking about students protesting. Students have every right to protest, but what we're talking about is anti-Semitic actions on university campuses. And if you think I'm going to have the people who are perpetrating these things on the programme, you've got another thing coming. It's 19 minutes past 8.
LBC This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
21 minutes past 8. Edward Isaacs is with us, President of the Union of Jewish Students. He met with the Prime Minister and the Education Secretary and University Vice-Chancellors in Downing Street this morning. We're going to go to your calls now. Harry is in Bury St Edmunds. Hello, Harry.
Evening, Iain. Hope you're well. Evening, Edward, as well. Just quick one. Iain, as you know, I go to UEA. I'm absolutely disgusted by what you said about an hour ago. I mean, I was of the thoughts that UEA had actually got their act together on this, and they were doing a better job than they were with their finances, but evidently not. Edward, my question: where do you think the education system has gone wrong in educating, people of my age, in their 20s? About what anti-Semitism is. I was privately and state educated for secondary education in my A-levels, and we had talks from the Holocaust Memorial Trust. We did modules on Nazi Germany, Kristallnacht, all the way through to the end of the war. What is going wrong with the education system? Because I can't fathom that it's just some kind of, and I use the word really, really carefully, kind of hip thing that students have just jumped on board with. There must be some sort of miseducation, because it can't be just ignorance.
Well, thank you very much for your call, Harry. To answer your question, I think you've already answered your own question insofar as a lot of your education and a lot of the education people receive about anti-Semitism is about the historical anti-Semitism coming from the far right, from Nazi Germany, etc. And the Holocaust Educational Trust that we work with does a phenomenal job at that. But so much of the contemporary anti-Semitism that we see on campuses today is actually emanating from the far left. So only a couple of days ago did we receive news that, for example, at the Warwick encampment, the protesters there are accusing the university of yielding before the Zionist lobby. Now, that's outright anti-Semitism, but they're not using the word Jew. There's no kind of sign of the word Jewish, but more often than not, far-left anti-Semites use the word Zionist instead of the word as a ploy for the word Jew. Now listen, 84% of Jewish students across the country and nearly a vast majority of Jewish people more widely outwardly define as Zionist. And you've got to ask the question as to what's going on there. And talking about the Zionist lobby and these tropes of power, etc., is just classic anti-Semitism in that respect.
And this word Zionist, it's now become effectively a pejorative word, hasn't it? And I wonder if you stopped 100 random people in the street, you said, what does the word Zionist mean? I wonder how many of them would actually know. Because, I happily describe myself as a Zionist because I do believe in the right of Israel to exist. And I think it's appalling that anybody thinks that Israel shouldn't have a right to exist. And if you are using Zionist in a pejorative way, it means that you don't think that Israel has a right to exist. And therefore, the likelihood, I'm not saying this happens in every case, the likelihood is that you have a bit of anti-Semitism within you. And people don't like to hear that because they don't like to look at themselves in the mirror.
Very much so. Listen, it's difficult, and because there's a complete lack of nuance also on campus as well. It's important to say that Jewish students can be proud, unapologetic Zionists while also deeply caring about the cause of Palestinian human rights and doing so by being true to their Jewish values. That certainly is the case for me. I know it's the case for many, many Jewish students across campuses.
And there doesn't seem to be an equivalent word for being pro-Palestinian state, and maybe somebody ought to invent it, because if you believe in a two-state solution, you can be a Zionist, but you can also be somebody who wants a Palestinian state. And I think that's where the overwhelming majority of people are at the moment. But of course, people also say, Edward, that all of this anti-Semitic stuff on campus wouldn't be happening if Israel hadn't taken the actions that it has in Gaza and killed so many innocent Palestinians. That's at the root of it. What do you say to that?
It simply isn't, because we know, according to CST's most recent report, that the vast majority of anti-Semitism post-October the 7th happened before Israel even dared respond to the horrific attacks perpetrated on October the 7th. So I simply would just say that that's not the case.
Right, Harry, thank you for your call. Let's go to Saeed in Westminster. Hi, Saeed.
Hello, Ian. Hi.
Hello.
Ian, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, you started your session, great show, by the way. You started your session by talking about Eurovision. And, of course, we sympathize with the Israeli lady, the singer that's being held in her hotel room because of demonstrations. But I've never heard you saying anything about the Russian singer that was banned from last Eurovision. Also, so this is the first question. For Edward, I just wanted to ask him, what does he define an anti-Semitic attack to be like? Is disagreeing with Israel anti-Semitic? Would he consider somebody shouting at demonstrators, you are Hamas sympathizers, to be Islamophobic if they were a Jew? And then if you think that the majority of the students, as you were discussing, voting the Jewish associations out of their bodies, of the student bodies, and in universities all across Europe and in America, they are demonstrating and voicing their disagreement with what Israel is doing. Isn't it the time now for the Jewish community just to stop and think and reflect on why is this happening? And maybe disagreeing with their government, with their right-wing government of what they're doing. I think they are hurting them more than the demonstrating students at universities. And thank you so much.
Okay, well, let me answer the first question.
Yeah.
I don't think I have commented on the banning of the Russian singer because we don't generally talk about the Eurovision Song Contest particularly much on the programme. Yeah, okay, well, let me address that. I'm not particularly in favour of banning people from taking part in cultural events. I've never been particularly in favour of banning different countries from the Olympic Games either.
Okay.
I'm not sure that it really
Maybe you should have
hurts.
mentioned that when you mentioned the
I've gone through the entire programme today with people telling me what I should and shouldn't say. I'll say it my way.
Sorry about that.
If you don't like it, that's fair enough. But I think there is a slight difference here in that Russia has invaded another country. Now,
I see. Israel invaded Gaza.
No. See, there again. Israel defended itself in response to the 7th of October attack. People. So I think there is a difference. There is a difference, Saeed.
Yeah.
Over to Edward.
Thank you, Saeed. I begin by pushing back on what you said in terms of referring to it as their right-wing government. Jewish people don't have a vote in Israeli elections. Jewish people aren't responsible for the actions of the Israeli government.
Do you have another nationality, Edward?
Well, he's British.
I have a British passport.
You don't have an Israeli nationality because every Jew around the world is welcome to Israel.
That's correct.
To get their passport. And do you have an Israeli passport?
No, I don't.
Honestly.
I do not vote in Israeli I do not vote in Israeli elections. But listen, I think
maybe 90% of the Jewish people here have Israeli passports.
How do you know that?
Well, I mean, I know a lot of Jewish friends,
and also,
and they do.
So what if they do?
Well, then they vote in Israel, and they have to voice their disagreement with their government rather than putting,
And how do you know that they don't? I know plenty of Jewish people who are against the Netanyahu government. Why do you assume that everyone in Britain would be?
Why don't you talk about this in this program? Why are you?
Well, because it's not the subject of this program, Saeed. The subject of the program is anti-Semitism on university campuses, which is presumably why you phoned in.
Saeed, I think it's important to say that it's not anti-Semitic to legitimately disagree with the state of Israel. I proudly represented many Jewish students in speaking up against much of the judicial reforms that were originally planned by this current Israeli government before October the 7th. But it is so important to recognise that Israel plays a core part in so many Jewish people's identity, but nonetheless they are not responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, and you can legitimately disagree with the actions of the Israeli government while still being a proud Zionist and a proud Jewish person.
Saeed, thank you. Spirited call there, it has to be said. We'll take more in just a moment here on LBC. It's 8:31, news headlines with Darryl Jackson.
LBC can reveal probation officers have been told to stop supervising some criminals released from prison on licence. In a private meeting last week, they've been advised not to monitor those who've served 2/3 of their licence to reduce their workload. A watchdog's called for Wandsworth Prison in southwest London to be put into emergency measures, and inspections found ongoing failings in security, overcrowding and other issues. And interest rates have been kept on hold at 5.25%, but the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, says there is encouraging news on inflation, meaning a cut from the 16-year high is getting closer. LBC weather mostly dry and settled tonight. A band of rain in the far north moving northeastwards and a low of 5 degrees.
This is LBC. This is LBC. Message Iain Dale on WhatsApp now on 0345 60 60 973.
8:34. Priya on an email says, how interesting that Iain Dale is not having the courage to mention that many of the anti-Jewish protests are led by Muslims. I mean, I'd love to know what you want to achieve by sending that email, Priya, because obviously there are many Muslims who are leading these protests. There are many members of the Socialist Workers' Party that are leading these protests as well. There are many people who are far-left anarchists who are leading these protests too. This is not a case of trying to divide people. People feel very strongly on both sides of this war. Whenever there's a conflict anywhere in the world, you have people feeling very strongly on both sides. It would be nice to think that you could have a sensible debate on this issue, but having been covering this now since October the 7th, and of course the whole wider Middle East conflict for many years before that, I have to come to the conclusion that it brings out the most disgusting, evil lunatics in our country, and they feel able to say things that they would never normally say in polite conversation. I don't put Saeed in that category, although I thought he was slightly edging there when he said that 90% of British Jews hold an Israeli passport. Saeed, you might like to ring back and apologise for misleading our listeners, because a report from 2015 says 6% of Jews in England have an Israeli passport, not 90%, as Saeed claimed. Now, this might have increased a bit, because there was evidence of British Jews obtaining passports of other states during the years in which the Labour Party was particularly riddled with anti-Semitism, but it wouldn't have gone up to anything like 90%. Because what Saeed was effectively doing there was trying to insinuate that if a British Jew has an Israeli passport, they have divided loyalties, which is an anti-Semitic trope in itself, I would say. We have Edward Isaacs with us, President of the Union of Jewish Students. We're looking at what's happening on our universities in the light of the meeting that was held today in Downing Street. Let's go to Lee in Penna. Hello, Lee.
Hi, guys. Hi. Absolutely fantastic show. I must be one of the 94% that's never owned an Israeli passport as a Jew, never voted.
Shame on you, Lee. Call yourself a proper Jew, honestly.
And I know, shame. Northwest London, there you go, through and through. And honestly, there's yes, wonderful place. There's plenty of other countries I think I would live in first. But that's a topic for another day. But it is actually, it's quite infuriating when you do hear things like that, because it's just wrong. And as you I just want to pick up quickly, it's the whole sensible conversation. It would be so nice if people could, but unfortunately over the last few months, and I've stayed out of a lot of conversations, it brings out the very worst in people. But, anyway, the question I wanted to ask is, my daughter, please God, this September, does her A-levels, is going to university. I have a niece at university. We haven't heard much about what's going on there, but, I have a daughter that, please God, will be going to university in September. So you do start thinking, what's in store for her? I know it's kind of vague, but what is in store for her? What am I sending my child to? I want her to grow and experience the world and what it has to offer her and throw at her, whether it's good or bad. But what am I putting her into?
Does she know which university she wants to go to?
She knows which one she wants to go to. Leeds. She has others, Manchester, Nottingham and Leeds. So, and yes, it's probably not like it is in the States at the moment, but that's at the moment. I know the Prime Minister had a meeting this morning, but like Edward was saying so eloquently, I've got to say, what is going to be done? It's all very well when people say, they're going to clamp down, but what actually does that mean? And yeah.
Okay, Edward.
Yeah.
Well, Lee, thank you very much for your call.
Pleasure.
And it's great to hear that, and I hope your daughter is excited about university.
She is, yes.
And I hope she does get into her first choice Leeds, as so many Jewish students for many years have had a phenomenal time there.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's important to say that Jewish students are, of course, having an incredibly tough time now and facing really horrendous scenes on campus. But what I will say as well that is also true is that Jewish students more often than not are so resilient. And through the support that we've been providing them at the Union of Jewish Students, JSOCs, namely Jewish Societies, have been busier than ever. Friday night dinners have had more attendees than ever before. And just to speak to an example in Leeds, the Leeds Jewish Community Centre was attacked with anti-Semitic graffiti one evening. The night after that happened, they had their largest ever party in that house, which I think is testament to the resilience of Jewish students who still see value in living meaningful Jewish lives on campus.
See, Lee, when you said what advice would Edward have for your daughter, I mean, there was a momentary thought that went through my head in that my advice would be to tell her to go on a gap year first.
You see, this is it, isn't it? And I wouldn't do that.
I went on a gap year and it was the best thing I ever did. So
I think
gap years are great things. But if you give in to this kind of thing...
Totally.
So it was a facetious comment, and
it's absolutely fine. And very lastly, what I will say on that is that when this all when it was bad over the last few months, bless her, and I love her to death, it's an amazing girl. She was working up in Covent Garden every weekend, finishing at 9-10 o'clock at 16, 17 years old, when all the demos were all there. And we were a little bit, but she just did it every weekend, carried on as normal. And everything was fine, because everything was fine. We also do have to remember it is bad, but let's not, let's be sensible about it. It's not, it's bad, but we can still walk around our days and just be normal and act normal and just carry on as normal, and you'll probably find it will be absolutely fine.
Okay, Lee, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Good luck to your daughter as well. Hugo's in Buckhurst Hill. Hello, Hugo.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for taking my call.
Hi.
So I want to express myself properly here. So just want to clarify. Whatever your religion, whatever your race, whatever your colour, your sexual preference, whatever your worldviews, peace be upon you. Carry on. They're all great. Let live and let live. Yet I find recently with everything that we view online, the atrocious acts of violence that's happening in Gaza, that one feels obliged to talk out against it or protest. And to then be labelled, I'm not saying there aren't incidents where some of the protestees or some people online are not saying things that are outright racist. Yet I feel almost that there is an attempt to silence every opinion that speaks out against the atrocious acts that's happening in Gaza. And I feel almost that uni students, whether Jewish or anyone else, no one should have to feel unsafe. Everyone, but if you're Jewish and you're a student and you feel unsafe because people are protesting in what I believe it to, you may not, what I believe it to be genocide. It might not be factually correct, the terminologies might not be right, but there are killing of innocent people, thousands, tens of thousands, and people ought to do whatever little, because the politicians and the people in power are doing nothing. So students and people ought to do something about it, and all we have in our power is to protest.
You're absolutely right, and you have every right to make your views heard. And I mean, I like to think that you're able to do that on radio stations like this, but you should also be able to do it on protest. But let me ask you, if you were, if you were a Jewish student at the University of Sheffield, and you were walking down the street, and the pro-Palestinian protesters were coming the other way, and they were chanting this, say it loud and clear: "We don't want no Zionists here." Now, ignoring the ungrammatical bit of that, I mean, how would that make you feel?
Absolutely terrible. But we cannot put that. Insulated or not, one incident is too many. Yes, but the times that what we are witnessing that's unfolding in Gaza, those innocent kids, they don't have anywhere to turn to. Whereas, so now it becomes a bit of a balancing act where someone's feelings are hurt or they feel scared, right? Shouldn't do. Absolutely, it's horrible. That example you're giving me is absolutely terrible. Yet there are 10 times, 1,000 times worse incidents that's happening in Gaza with innocent people, and they have no one. They don't have your guest. I'm sorry, I missed this gentleman's name.
Edward,
and he is his position in. His title is.
He's the president of the Union of Jewish Students.
See how great that the Jewish students have a president of Jewish students. Brilliant. That's great. What about the students in Gaza that have had their schools bombed? No schools left, no hospitals left. As of 4 days, there's no hospitals left in Gaza. There's no schools. These kids next 3 decades are destroyed. These kids have nothing. They've lost limbs. They've lost parents, families, homes. They have absolutely nothing. Are we supposed to not say anything because we might offend?
No, but nobody's suggesting that. But anyway, it's enough of me. Let Edward respond to you, Hugo. Because look, I think you've put forward a really sensible, well thought out view, which I think even listeners who might be on the other side of the debate from you will respect you for that, because you've done it in a way that it is completely reasonable. But unfortunately, the language in this isn't always that way. But why does language matter, Edward?
Language matters because language exists in context and language has meaning. And let me just start by saying that, Hugo, I am also appalled at the horrendous loss of life going on in Gaza right now. But speaking to the reality on the ground which Jewish students are facing, the language, so much of the language that is emanating from much of these encampments are not meaningless political statements. We're seeing language, for example, emanating from the encampments at the University of Newcastle, calling for, quotes, intifada until victory. That's not a meaningless political statement. The Intifada period was a period during the late 1990s and early 2000s whereby there was a spate of horrific terrorist attacks across Israel which just simply targeted innocent civilians. So this is a direct call for violence against Jewish people. So language has consequences, language has impacts. And yes, of course, at the Union of Jewish Students, we respect the right to protest. We see the importance of free speech on campus, but we also need to see, and the message was loud and clear today at Downing Street, that we told Vice-Chancellors that they need to make the red lines very clear. Language such as Intifada until victory, or glory to the martyrs, and so much more is not welcome on campus.
But what should be done then? I mean, if you've got hundreds of people chanting these slogans, do you expect the police to go into the protests and arrest them all?
I think it's for universities and their security teams who have expertise in these areas to work out how they enforce the law in that respect. But as I said earlier, the security minister made it very clear. The glorification and the celebration of a prescribed terrorist group, the actions of a prescribed terrorist group, simply is illegal, and university vice-chancellors have to recognise that.
Hugo, great call. Thank you very much indeed. Mike says here, are the people of Gaza responsible for Hamas? Well, they did elect them in the first place, so you could say yes, and Hamas haven't held any elections since, I think, 2005. We'll have more calls to Edward Isaacs, President of the Union of Jewish Students, in just a few moments' time. It's 8:47.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
A moral duty to university chancellors and vice-chancellors will be told by the Prime Minister to look after Jewish students as more of these pro-Palestinian demonstrations seem to be taking place. Mikhail Kotler-Wunsch, who is Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism.
This is pro-Iran.
They would say to you, Mikhail, this is anti-slaughter, this is anti-genocide.
Israel is just on the front lines, and once again Jews may be the bloody canary in the coal mine.
Richard Tice, the leader of Reform UK.
Ultimately, you're going to have to bring in either university security or the police.
Coming up, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, tomorrow morning from 7 with Nick Ferrari at Breakfast, LBC. This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
9 minutes to 9. Robert says, your attitude is exactly the problem and not the students protesting. British Jews are shouting so loud about how unfairly they are treated, but in most instances, it's not true. Not sure how you would know that, Robert, but hey. For example, the so-called victim that wasn't allowed to cross the street by the police during a pro-Palestinian protest, and the media choosing to show only what recording was in line with their side. But on social media, clearly there are more recordings showing exactly that guy wanted to incite. Iain, check the other recordings available on social media if you haven't seen it already, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Well, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I spoke out against this because I thought he had behaved rather disgracefully in that incident. Because you're right, the initial video was, I thought, very concerning. But when you saw the longer video, you got another side. And I called that out because it was the wrong thing to do. Anyway, Robert continues. Israel has a very good PR department. Other views are available on that, and is able to push their agenda, how they're the victims, even though the reality is totally different. I'm not supporting what happened on the 7th of October, not even for a second. And then, unfortunately, it goes off the bottom of my screen. Okay, I hear what you say. You say the Israeli PR department is very good. I actually think the PR department has been, in the first few weeks of this whole episode since the 7th of October, it was quite good, but since that, it's been an absolute shambles. And they haven't been able to explain why they're doing what they're doing. You might say, well, it's indefensible, so no wonder they can't explain it. But I'm afraid some of the spokespeople that have been put up to try and defend the Israeli position have not done their side any favours. Edward Isaacs is with us, President of the Union of Jewish Students. Nick is in Elstree. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Iain. Great show as always. I think education is what's needed. I've just returned back from California with my family, and we did some travelling around. And just to give you a bit of an insight, one of your callers just before mentioned about genocide. Now, you imagine you're going yourself down the M25 and you see a big board saying genocide is not anti-Semitism, right? This is what was on one of the major highways in Los Angeles. When people use that word genocide and what's going on in Gaza, it is disgusting, it is inaccurate, and it is factually wrong. So it should be called out. It is not a genocide. It's what you define a genocide as what happened in the Holocaust, when it was just indiscriminate, trying to eliminate a race or religion. Israel is not trying to eliminate the Muslim people, the Islamic faith at all. It's looking to eliminate...
No, but the accusation is that Israel is looking to eliminate the Palestinian people in Gaza. That's the accusation.
Wrong. That is wrong. If that was the case, so the argument that's put forward that it's a genocide, then why do they give warning? Why were they moving people across to certain areas? The reason why they attacked or targeted hospitals and schools is because Hamas were hiding within those locations. It's been proven on numerous occasions. They are...
Okay. All right, but we're going slightly off the subject that we're talking about here, if you don't mind me saying so, Nick.
That's fine, but I think it's education. When you look at the universities, etc. So the reason why I mentioned America particularly is there's been a lot of instances whereby students, whether they be Muslim or far left, etc., have stopped Jewish people going into their universities. Now, that is absolutely, utterly disgusting. And I think that's what worries me here, and people jump on the bandwagon. There needs to be more education to everyone about the Holocaust, about what's happened in Israel. I do not agree with everything that has happened at the moment. I do not agree with Israelis kicking out people in the West Bank, etc. That is wrong. But at the same point, if people don't understand the history of what's happened over the last 70 years, etc., then that's the reason why they sort of jump on this bandwagon. Oh, it's always Israel's fault. A lot of these protests and the people who attend them are ill-educated and ill-informed. And if they're not educated correctly, then all they're doing is following the media tribe, etc. It's when you go to school, I think someone else mentioned it on your call before, you get taught about all the different things that have gone on historically. Now, I think the Holocaust is quite a prominent moment in history.
I think part of the problem was illustrated on the TV news a couple of weeks ago. I was seeing a young girl interviewed, I can't remember which university it was, and she said, I'm a history student. And she was just mouthing all the usual anti-Semitic platitudes. And I'm thinking, don't think you're going to get a first-class degree, if I'm honest. Steve's in Burgess Hill. Hello, Nick, thank you. Steve's in Burgess Hill. Hi.
Hey, hello, good evening. Thank you for taking my call. I'm a little bit nervous, so forgive me if I don't get the words out.
You'll be fine, Steve.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask Edward, in your role, just a couple of two quick questions, really. Well, there's three elements to it. So I listened to the BBC Radio 4 interview this morning with some of the students. I believe it was at Leeds University, and the spokesperson was interviewed. And when I asked about what the demands were, she said the following. And I'd just like to ask Edward whether the following three things, they're very quick, whether they're anti-Semitic or not. The first one was that the university should cut ties with weapons producers. The second one was universities should cut ties with any Israeli universities who are based themselves on the occupied Palestinian territories. And the last one is that no war criminals should be allowed on campus, any campus. So just to ask Edward whether those three things are anti-Semitic in nature.
Thank you very much for your call, Steve. In answer to your question, I'd want to know why these protesters want to cut ties with Israeli universities. I want to know who they're referring to as a war criminal. And I'd like to know why they think the university should cut ties with various weapons agreements, many of which are misreported and simply these agreements don't exist.
I think, to be fair, Steve said cut ties with universities on occupied territories. Steve, correct me if I'm wrong. Did you mean all Israeli universities, or just those based on occupied territories?
No, you're right, Ian. It was those based on occupied Palestinian territory.
Thank you very much, Steve, for clarifying. So, listen, I think it's in terms of looking at I think I'd focus on no war criminals on campus. I think what we've there's been, in particular in Leeds, there's been horrific protests around the Jewish chaplain there, who is an Israeli citizen, who did go back to fulfil his duty to complete his reserve duty, and there've been horrific protests against him. He's received death threats. His family has had to move out of his home, amongst so much more. So I'd like to think that I don't have to draw the conclusion that they're not referring to him when they refer to war criminals in that respect, because a huge amount of the protests against him have utilised that language. But in all honesty, I think sadly they are referring to that, and if so, then I really do think that is it's anti-Jewish kind of hatred in that respect. In terms of the cutting ties with Israeli universities and in the occupied West Bank, I think we'd have to have a more wide-ranging discussion with them on that. So thank you very much.
Steve, thank you for that. Edward, thank you for joining us for the last hour. Some really interesting calls, great responses from you. And Edward is president of the Union of Jewish Students. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to change gear. I think it's about time we did, frankly. Now, I found this statistic quite alarming in some ways. A third of men aged between 20 and 34 live at home with their parents. Now, data from the ONS reveals that 33% of young men in the UK, that's 2.2 million, were living with their parents last year, compared with 22% of women of the same age. Now, I can't account for that difference between men and women. Maybe you can. So in total, 28% of people aged 20 to 34 were living with their parents, up from 26% in 2013. Now, what is that down to? Is it due to the cost of living, or the inability to get housing? And what's it like living with your parents at the age of 34?